Everyone. Welcome to today's Badger Talks Live. I'm Fran Paleo-Moyer. I've been producing Badger Talks Live since, April when we went into quarantine. And we created Badger Talks Live to be a pleasant distraction for people. And I think we've been pretty successful. We've had great viewership thanks to all of you for tuning in each week. What have we done together? We've painted together, we've meditated together, showcasing all of the great talent around campus. We've learned about foxes and wolves in our backyards and how we coexist with them. We've learned about Amish culture. We've taken tours of Mills Music Library, the Chazen Museum. Oh my gosh, the amazing tour of the UW veterinary hospitals and all the great work that they're doing. Just such exciting ability for us to showcase all the great things happening on campus. And that's not to downplay all of the great research and work around COVID that's happening. And my colleague, Veronica Rickert, who's been producing some amazing Badger Talks with great information to keep us all safe. So that being said, we're developing more programming for Badger Talks Live based on its success. So feel free to throw some comments in the chat and say hey when you tune in here. Happy to say hi back to you. If you have ideas on things that you'd like to see in terms of programming that we're doing for Badger Talks Live, I'd love to hear from you. Again, throw it in the chat or feel free to email me at fpaleo@wisc.edu. So next week, Mary Hark is going to be talking about the art of paper making. If you get a chance, check out her website before you tune in at maryhark.com. She has done some phenomenal work and she has gorgeous imagery out on her website. She's done teaching and work all around the country, but also has done a lot of work in Ghana, West Africa. So we're excited to showcase her work. And also, if you're interested, sign up at badgertalks.wisc.edu to receive the emails that we send out every week so you can kind of stay up to date on what's coming up next week. So today, I'm so excited when we heard from Wisconsin Public Radio that they wanted to bring Lori Skelton, the classical radio host, on. I'm a huge fan of public radio and Lori's work. And I hear she's a bit of a foodie too. So Lori, we'll have to bring you back for another talk another time. And so I sent out the email for this week, letting people know that we would be having Lori on the show, and double whammy, she'll be talking about the life of William Grant Still, an important American composer who you'll be interested in learning about today. And when I sent the email out, my colleague, Pernisha Clifton, who is the Director of Youth Protection and Compliance for UW System, emailed me right away. And she said, Fran, I'm so excited about next week's show because you're going to be talking about William Grant Still, and he's one of my favorite composers. I've performed his work. And we didn't have, Peter, my son Peter just signed on. Hey, Peter. We have an introducer for the week. So I thought, hey, this will be great. Pernisha, you can introduce Lori and talk about your work with William Grant Still, and here we go. So without further ado, here is Pernisha. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that amazing introduction. Again, my name is Pernisha Clifton, and I am an alum of UW-Madison, but I am also the Director of Youth Protection and Compliance for UW System. So like Fran said, when she said she was going to be doing a presentation with Lori about William Grant Still, I was all over it. You know, I've loved his works for years, and it's so amazing, especially during this time, to see Black composers featured. And, you know, I'm very much a part of the Black Music Matters movement. And so when I said, oh, look at Madison, like we're ahead of the game, we are really focusing on what's important in music right now. So I was just truly honored to be brought here. I myself am a classically trained opera singer. I spent 10 years on the road. I've shared the stage with Placido Domingo and Denise Graves. I was actually the first African-American to sing in a Chinese opera house solely in Mandarin. I was one of the pioneer members of the I Sing Beijing project, which is what took me to Beijing. So I am so excited to be talking specifically about William Grant Still today and just really to hear Lori's take on this. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about Lori. So Lori, let's see here. They gave me a very specific bio. Classical announcer Lori Skelton began working with Wisconsin Public Radio in 1993 and is the host of Afternoon Classics each weekday and the producer and host of Wisconsin Classical. She had planned to get her master's in conducting at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, but by chance discovered the studios of WWM and chose radio instead. 2 years later, she began working for WFMR. In addition to her work on WPR, Skelton is a trained singer and conductor who performs with the Milwaukee Symphony Chorus. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lori Skelton. Such an honor. Welcome.
Pranisha, thank you so much for that enthusiastic welcome. And it is an honor to be talking about someone who, for many, is a gateway not into just what African American composers are doing, but a gateway into how classical music in America was changing and shifting throughout the 20th century. I actually want to start by mentioning a composer who might be a little more familiar to some people than William Grant Still is, and that's Antonin Dvorak, who was a Czech composer, but in the early 1890s was working in New York. He was the head of the National Conservatory of Music in America, and he was very interested in Native American music and the spirituals that he heard sung by some of the students, including future composer Harry T. Burleigh. Dvorak stated, quote, "I'm convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." So about 2 years after Antonin Dvorak said that, William Grant Still was born in Woodville, Mississippi, born in 1895. His ancestors were Black and also Native American and Scottish and Irish and Spanish. Both of his parents were teachers. His father was a band leader who sadly died when William Grant Still was only 3 years old. His mother decided to move back to her family in Little Rock. She was an English teacher. She remarried when William Grant Still was 9, and her new husband, William's stepfather, had a love of classical music and opera, and they would listen to records together. They would go to operettas together. And when he wasn't listening to European classical music with his stepfather, he was listening to his maternal grandmother singing spirituals. William Grant Still began violin lessons when he was 15 years old. The year before he graduated as valedictorian from high school, he would go on to teach himself to play the clarinet, the saxophone, the oboe, the cello, the double bass, and the viola. His mother wanted him to go to medical school. He started out at Wilberforce University in Ohio, intending to get a Bachelor of Science degree, but when he wasn't in the lab, he was conducting the school orchestra. He was starting to arrange for the orchestra and the band, and decided, I need to focus on music. He got a scholarship to Oberlin. And while he was studying formally at Oberlin Conservatory, he also branched out and took private lessons from two very different composers. One of them was George Whitefield Chadwick, who was a Massachusetts-based composer. He was one of the last to have studied in the late 19th century in Germany with established composers there. He was also influenced by the realist movement. He wanted there to be a very down-to-earth approach to all the arts. He wanted them to reflect everyday life, even when you were in a grand concert hall playing a grand symphony orchestra. But William Grant Still also studied with one of the avant-garde French-born composers, Edgar Varèse, who is known as one of the first to work in electronic music in the 20th century. This is a composer who said things like sound is living matter and musical space should be open rather than unbounded. A lot of influences coming to a young man, and he's barely 22, 23 years old at this time. What is he going to do with that? And as I said, what happens throughout his compositional career as it's moving through up until 1970 is an absolutely fascinating way to look at how American music develops in this one particular person. The first piece we're going to hear is called Summerland. And the violinist, Kelly Hull Thompson, notes in the liner notes in her CD that this was the second of 3 visions for solo piano that was originally written for William Grant Still's first wife. Summerland, you can take that name literally if you wish, especially if you're in Wisconsin and you're already missing hotter days in August. But this is also Summerland, where the soul may go after death. It's another word for heaven. But it's a vision of heaven that utilizes jazz and blues, as well as a little bit of French Impressionism. Here is Summerland. the violinist Kelly Hall Tompkins and Craig Ketter at the piano with Summerland of William Grant Still. Still a young man. He's in his early 20s. He joins W.C. Handy's band in Memphis, mostly as a wind player. 2 years later, he's in the Navy to serve in World War I. After the war, he again picks up with W.C. Handy's band, this time in Harlem, which of course brought him into contact with other musicians and other artists, visual artists and writers such as Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes. Other members of the Harlem Renaissance would have an influence throughout his life. He would perform in a lot of dance orchestras, Broadway pit orchestras, working with the likes of U.B. Blake, Sophie Tucker, Artie Shaw. He was a part of the Black Swan Record Company, first as an arranger and then later as music director. He was arranging popular music for radio, including works for one Paul Whiteman, who is best known to us today as the guy who commissioned Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue and Freddie Groffet's Grand Canyon Suite. But in the midst of all of this popular music, in the midst of all of this arranging for various ensembles, working as need be for what the size of the orchestra is, what the size of the hall is, there was also one other influence that wasn't as noticeable immediately, but would show up more and more in his later works. And that is a composer who was born in London, a composer named Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He was born in 1875 to an English woman and a doctor from Sierra Leone. And he was named Samuel Coleridge Taylor because his mother admired the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. By the early part of the 20th century, Samuel Coleridge Taylor's cantatas, pieces for chorus, sometimes narrator, definitely with orchestra, they were just as popular as Handel's Messiah. So while William Grant Still had certainly a love and an appreciation for spirituals, he held off a little in arranging spirituals early on in his career. He was, however, starting to write art songs, influenced in many ways by the vocal music of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. And we're going to hear one of his pieces in just a moment. You're going to hear baritone Robert Honeysucker and pianist Vivian Taylor. This is one of the songs in his song cycle called Songs of Separation. 5 songs in the cycle, and they're in the style of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, but very specifically setting American poets. Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes. Here, we're very direct, very emotional. We have the European tradition of the art song that's married to the cadence of American and especially African American speech. And the song we're going to hear is the 4th in the cycle. The poem was originally written by Countee Cullen, and it's called If You Should Go. Poet County Cullen, set by William Grant Still, the song If You Should Go from Songs of Separation, the 5-song cycle. As William Grant Still moves through the 1920s, the titles of his pieces are certainly reflecting where his mind is. Darker America, which he said was intended to suggest the triumph of a people over their sorrows through fervent prayer. There are also tone poems about Africa. There are ballets that take various different cultures into an area that didn't normally see colored dancers. And yet by the end of the 1920s, and I quote the composer here, I knew I wanted to write a symphony. I knew it had to be an American work, and I wanted to demonstrate how the blues could be elevated to the highest musical level. The Symphony No. 1 is called the Afro-American Symphony. It was performed in 1931 by the Rochester Philharmonic under the direction of Howard Hanson. This was the first time the complete score of a work by an African American, by a Black musician, was performed by a major orchestra. By the end of World War II, this piece would have been performed around the United States and also in Berlin and in Paris and in London. We're going to hear 2 movements from the symphony. And I want you to think back to Antonin Dvorak. If you know his symphony from the New World, the Symphony No. 9, where he was using melodies that in the second movement were very poignant, performed on the English horn. And the third movement, more of a scherzo, very energetic, almost danceable. I hear parallels in what William Grant Still was doing here at the start of the 1930s with his Symphony No. 1. So this is the second, followed by the third movement of William Grant Still's Symphony No. 1, the Afro-American Symphony, and you'll hear John Jeter conducting the Fort Worth Symphony. Don Jeter and the Fort Worth Symphony with the second and the third movement of William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony No. 1. And yes, you heard a banjo in that second movement that we heard in movement number 3. I believe that is the first time a banjo was ever called for in an orchestra. And if you're sitting there thinking, that melody in the last movement we heard sounded kind of close to I Got Plenty of Nuttin' from Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, we know that they may have had similar influences, but William Grant Still wrote the Afro-American Symphony at least 4 years before Porgy and Bess made it to the stage. So I think we can safely say that Gershwin might have leaned heavily on William Grant Still for this one. So in the 30s, William Grant Still moves to Los Angeles. He gets the first of his 3 Guggenheim Fellowships while he is there and starts working on his first opera. But he's also starting to work for film studios, arranging for film studios. He arranged music for Pennies from Heaven with Bing Crosby, Lost Horizon with Ronald Colman. He was briefly the music director of 20th Century Fox, but there were, I believe the current phrase is artistic differences. He did not approve of how 20th Century Fox wanted African American performers and African American music to be portrayed in the films. So we have someone who is certainly finding a great deal of success in so-called traditional classical music, but he is also starting to come up against prejudice. He is starting to come up against wanting to be true to his own ideals as a composer, as a creative individual, and finding resistance in some very uncomfortably stereotyped ways. It's one of the reasons why he waited a little bit longer in his compositional life to start arranging spirituals. But he was being approached by more and more people saying, we have so many wonderful arrangements that got us to this point, but now we need new arrangements. And we want you to start thinking about bringing the spiritual even further forward. They knew, because of all the things he had arranged for instruments, that he had a very keen ear for not just what's the proper pitch to put an instrument, but how to combine instruments so that everybody sounds a little bit better and everybody else is underscoring maybe a counter melody that might not be noticed otherwise. Here is someone who knows that arrangement is not just slap the melody on top of another instrument and let it go. This is someone who has a fascination with the internal workings of music, and even in something as supposedly as simple as a spiritual. Here is now where William Grant Still can start making inroads. You hear that. Unfortunately, we don't have time to hear it today, but you're going to hear that if you ever sit down and listen to his Symphony No. 2, which he called The Song of a New Race. This was a symphony where he especially wanted to talk about society becoming integrated with people working together, but using spirituals as the basis for bringing everybody forward. I'm going to quickly check with one of the questions that came in. Somebody wanted to know that did William Grant Still have children and did they become musicians? William Grant Still was married twice. Between his 2 families, there were a total of 6 children. To my knowledge, none of them are musicians, but Judith Ann Still, the last daughter in the 2 families, she is the curator, the caretaker of her father's legacy. She is the one maintaining many of the websites. She has expanded her father's autobiography. And for those of you who are fans of public radio's show, The Takeaway, William Grant Still's granddaughter, through Judith Ann, is Celeste Headley. So no musicians that I know of, but certainly some incredibly smart and open-hearted, generous with their smarts people. We move forward through the 30s. William Grant Still was asked to compose music for the New York World's Fair in 1939. I quote the composer again. "It seems to me that this must be the first time, musically speaking, that a colored man has ever been asked to write something extremely important that does not necessarily have to be colored. I must admit I can't help feeling proud of that distinction." Which is not to say that Song of the City, which was played nonstop at its point in the exhibition, didn't have its problems, because according to his granddaughter, he required police protection to go to the World's Fair on any day other than when colored people were allowed. So there were still barriers to be faced. And one of the reasons I think William Grant Still is such an example for what America does, not just a Black American musician, but what America does through its art, is how he kept moving forward. Yes, there was discrimination. Yes, there was a number of obstacles to be overcome. I'm going to give you some of the firsts that he did, and then look back at where things didn't go quite as far as you would have wanted. In 1936, he was the first to conduct at the Hollywood Bowl, first African American to conduct a major American orchestra in a performance of his own works. He wrote an opera called Troubled Island with Langston Hughes. It originally debuted in 1939. It depicts the story of the revolution in Haiti that ended slavery. It was performed by the New York City Opera, first opera by an American to be performed by that company, first opera by an African American to be performed by a major company in the United States. In 1955, he conducted the New Orleans Philharmonic, first African American to conduct a major orchestra in the Deep South. And we had to wait, unfortunately, until after his death, until 1981, for his opera, A Bayou Legend, to be on television. First opera by an African American composer to be performed on national television. That said, he wrote operas that were rejected by the Metropolitan. There were always obstacles to be faced. And yet, here was a generous man, generous with his time. His daughter speaks of how generous he was with his children, singing gentle songs to them and reading to them all the time. Even, she says in retrospect, in the 50s and 60s, when money was really, really tight, the fellowships were running out, the prizes were not as forthcoming. And here was a composer not working in academia, so no steady job. And yet she didn't really realize this was a person who made certain that his children grew up in a very warm and very mind-expanding atmosphere. As a composer, the generosity would also come in his bringing the sounds of other cultures into the concert hall. Looking at the chats that we've got now, somebody has mentioned being a part of the UW Rock Chamber Orchestra that played William Grant Still's Panama Dances a couple of years ago. John says, "It was my introduction to William Grant Still and a lot of fun to play." Somebody else mentions, Renee says, "I love playing his miniatures for woodwind quintet." The miniatures for woodwind quintet were one of the ways that he was able to bring folk music of many different cultures into the concert hall. In 1961, he received the prize from the U.S. Commission for the UN for his orchestral work called The Peaceful Land, which was called the best composition honoring the United Nations. And I mentioned the folk suites. Those were written for chamber ensembles. And as I sit here in the music library at Wisconsin Public Radio, we've got a number of different arrangements, different recordings of these folk suites. You're going to hear a very short excerpt from the folk suite number 4 that was written in 1963. This is a suite that has songs from Venezuela, Mexico, and Brazil. And we'll start with we'll do the Venezuelan one, El Monigote, which is a song about a rag doll. And this is performed by the Calico Winds. So, one quick touch of folk music, looking at other cultures, as William Grant Still would want to bring other voices into the concert hall. He never attempted to downplay the struggle, the reality of prejudice, the reality of injustice. But I want to leave you with William Grant Still's music that I really think exemplifies his overall attitude that we all gain when all are included. This is a portion of a work he wrote in 1944 called Home for Orchestra. It's an extensive work for orchestra. We're going to hear the last 6.5 minutes or so. The second wife described it as, quote, inspired by the concept of a world being reborn spiritually after a period of darkness and desolation. Now, in 1944, that was certainly about the war. But the angular, the confused, the uncomfortable way that the piece starts, the first half of the piece could be personal, it could be societal. And we will hear that angular, uncomfortable music move into what becomes almost a brass fanfare. And that will lead to warm, luminous lines in the strings that will grow to including the entire orchestra in the finale. Contemporary reviewers of this piece always use the word hope. This is the Home for Orchestra. Again, John Jeter with the Fort Worth Symphony. of the 1944 Home for Orchestra by William Grant Still, John Jeter conducting the Fort Worth Symphony. I wish I had more time. There's so much more to say and definitely so much more to listen to, which is why I would invite you to keep listening to Wisconsin Public Radio, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, those of us who work at Wisconsin Public Radio have been adding more Black musicians, more composers of color, more composers who, or performers who need more time on air. And coming up between November the 9th and November the 15th, we are going to devote that week to William Grant Still. And we're talking across our genres. We're talking our classical music announcers. We're talking Jonathan Overby on Higher Ground on Saturday night. We're talking Simply Folk on Sunday evening as well. And we want to make this something that we do on a regular basis. We're hoping to do this once a month. Take a musician that we all can find incredible inspiration from across our genres, and all of us here working together to get a very intense listening experience for anyone who wants it. For those who would like to do a little research before then, I've got a couple of websites that would be great to check out. One is williamgrantstillmusic.com or musicbyblackcomposers.org. And I'm sure there are others that I'm missing, but these are two great ones to start with. These are two that I go to again and again and again. So again, all I can ask is keep your ears open, and thank you so much for listening today.